Welcome back to Sledgehammer Horror, guys. I am Ken Sledge, and let's talk horror. Now, today I am joined by the amazing Jay Hooft. Jay, how you doing today, man?
Good. How are you doing today?
I am doing very well. It is an honor to have you here. But before we start talking about why we're here, Jay, I would like to let people that don't know you get the chance to know you for a little bit. Jay, you are a film and music producer. Also have a YouTube channel called JKB, and you've interviewed tons of horror actors over the years. So before we go any further, what made you decide to want to start doing a YouTube channel?
Oh man, that's going way back. By the way, shout out to my cat Cameo right here. If you guys noticed in the video. I also wanted to say I love what you're doing on the channel. I love your enthusiasm for the community and bringing basically anybody in to talk about horror movies. It's amazing to see it. It reminds me of the saying about like horror movies. There's no such thing as a bad horror movie.
Yeah.
And you look at the community and you basically say the same thing. There's no such thing as a bad horror guest. So thank you
Right.
for what you're doing out there, man.
That means the world to me. Thank you, for real.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're doing because there's not a lot of people that do it for the reasons you're doing it. So thank you for that, man.
Yeah.
So how did it start? I grew up, watching horror movies with my friends and all that stuff, but that didn't really take effect into what I did online for years. What actually happened was my friends all went to film school, and I was the guy that bought all the equipment. So I had all this equipment lying around, and we're like, well, this was like 2009, and we watched Paranormal Activity. This is odd because I ended up into video game stuff, but we watched Paranormal Activity, I think a month before it was really caught on. You know, that whole craze that happened with that movie. We just happened to see it in Toronto and said, let's make a review. And this is in 2009, and our review had 10,000 views overnight. And we were like, I guess we're making a YouTube show. And that's how we
Yeah.
started reviewing video games and movies, and it blew up instantly. It's like that doesn't happen ever,
Right.
That
Well,
not
like you said,
anymore.
when you have a passion for something and people can see that passion, it really is infectious. And
Yeah.
so that was one of the reasons, obviously. And then, you've worked with Fangoria in the past as well on the YouTube series called Fright Bites. You were an on-screen host for Cineplex Canada. And
Yeah.
it's like you've done all these amazing things. Like you said, 2009, you were like, you know what, let's do a review on this movie that we really enjoyed. That blows up, and it's got you to do so many amazing things that maybe you wouldn't have if you guys wouldn't have drove by that theater at that right time, and um now you're currently working on a film called The Lurker, which is shooting in 2023, and a short horror film shooting in 2023 as well. Now, obviously, if they're shooting in 2023, we want to kind of keep it a little bit under wraps. But is there anything you can tell us about The Lurker or the short film you're working on?
Well, The Lurker was an interesting project because I had a viewer of my show that had watched for like 10 years. I've been around for a long time, and over that course, I've met a ton of people, and he knew that I was into horror movies, but my show was actually about mostly video games. So he's like, dude, you have to talk to somebody. So he reached out to his friend, and his friend Adam was making a horror movie, and he was somebody who had a lot of successful Kickstarters for comic books, and it was his first time sort of getting into filmmaking. I know that he had pitched shows to, like, in Canada, he was like CBC, and he was quite successful with selling some of that, something to do with Degrassi, which I'm a huge fan of back in the day, like Degrassi Junior High. So we had a meeting, and he's just like, I've seen some of the stuff you shot. We're looking for a DP, and I'd love you to come onto the project. So The Lurker is essentially a take on horror that I haven't quite seen yet. So that's kind of exciting in terms of social media and that aspect of it. And the idea of, like, because I was a YouTuber and I dealt with people that would be sort of quote unquote influencers behind the scenes. That's sort of a joke between influencers because we were like, okay. But there's some people that take that super seriously.
Yeah.
And the script deals with that idea and also the outcome of basically being a fake sort of influencer in front of the camera. If that affects the viewers, how does that affect the viewers? Do they notice those things? And I think nowadays kids or teenagers, primarily using TikTok and that sort of thing, they're not really paying attention to these influencers saying like, are these true emotions that they're showing us?
Sure.
So there's some outcomes to that sometimes, there's like, some kids out there really listen to these influencers and what they're basically spewing out. And, to not give anything away, there's a tragic event that happens because of some of the lies that are told by influencers. And then it's sort of a bit of a revenge tale. I don't want to say too much because in case you ever see the movie, but it's a sort of a revenge tale and a lesson about influencers. So I have kind of an insight into that. So it's exciting to be part of that. I'm not coming on as like a writer or anything, but I'm coming as a producer and the DP. So it's my job to make it look good, essentially at this point. But we've done a couple script read throughs, and I'm super excited to do that. Probably starting in March. Looking for locations at the moment, and I hope it's a unique. I have a lot of ideas in terms of how to actually shoot it based on the fact that I've been a YouTuber and an influencer.
Yeah.
So that's what's going on with the Lurker, yeah.
And the good thing about that too, guys, I know that this seems like it's so far away, but the good thing is if you follow Jay on all his social media links that I have down in the description, you can stay up to date on the Lurker and everything else he's working on. And before we get into the reason why you're here, I want to talk about the short film a little bit. What's this about?
Well, basically, I've got all this equipment sitting around, and I'm like, I think I should probably do something with this. It's been sitting here for like 5-6 years, and I got together with my best friend. We started throwing ideas around, and I think it's a matter of coming up with something unique that we haven't seen before in a horror short. Like, it'd be super easy because I live in an old church. You probably can kind of tell I'm in a loft area in an old church. So it'd be kind of easy to make a quote unquote horror movie in an old church, but how many times have we seen that? So again, without getting into detail, I don't like to give things away. I just like to throw it out there, and if people like it, they like it. But how do you make something new again, right? I've been watching a ton of movies just constantly. I watch 3 movies a day trying to just pick up on ideas and pick up on what has been done, what doesn't work, what works. So with a horror short, it's about, getting that story and immediately connecting with the characters, introducing a fear or an issue in the short, and then paying it off super quick, right? So I've learned from people like David Sandberg, the director of like Lights Out. He's like super famous for doing Lights Out, and then that picked up, and now he's got a whole career directing $100 million movies. And there's a whole slew of them. Like the Smile started out as a horror short.
Yeah.
All these
even Saw.
Yeah, even Saw, right?
So
I'm trying to think, like, if I'm going to do something, let's make it good. Let's just not go, okay, this is the bottom of the barrel. I could go do that easily, right? So it's about coming up with a proper idea. So I have something in mind, and I think it's unique, and we're going to try it this year or next year, I should say.
Well, I'm very excited to see it. And like I said, guys, you can follow along. You don't have to wait for me to give you updates on our weekly update show. You can follow Jay and get the word from the horse's mouth. So make sure you are doing that by following him on social media in the description, as well as subscribing to the YouTube channel. I don't bring people on here if I think their content is not very good, and I wouldn't promote it if I thought that. But the guy's been doing it since 2009. He's an influence on a lot of people that I know. So make sure you are doing that as well. Now, in order for you to be as big into horror as you are, Jay, horror had to start for you somewhere. So now I would like to go back to the past and talk about what got you started in the horror genre. And Jay, your first horror movie was?
Well, I actually brought some props. I couldn't find the Criterion. I also have VHS, but Silence of the Lambs. So I've got like a million versions of it. I have the original Criterion, which was super hard to come by. It still is very hard to come by on DVD. I honestly don't know where it is. VHS. I watched it on VHS for the first time. What happened was I must have been, I can't remember the age, 13, 12, somewhere around there. My mother had a copy of it on VHS tape. And this is, for some of the viewers out there, like, what's VHS? I'm sure a lot of your viewers know what VHS is, but some people out there are like, what the hell's VHS? I found the VHS tape, and my mom basically scolded me to a certain degree and was like, "You can't watch this." And I didn't understand what that meant at the time because I wasn't really introduced into horror
Yeah.
in a gruesome way. I had probably seen like one of the Nightmare on Elm Street films, but to me as a kid that was like Looney Tunes at that point because, you know, obviously Freddy Krueger became a Looney Tune character as it went on. So I saw something like that, but I never saw something that was taken seriously like Silence of the Lambs. I remember the Oscars came along and it was all over the news because of that. So it was
Yeah.
like, I have to watch this movie. I want to know what it's about. So one night I just put the VHS tape in, watched it, and was like both stunned and also interested in what the hell I just saw. You know, when you're a young kid, you don't really get a lot of the themes or the ideas behind it or understand the cinematography or anything. You just take the simple notes of it. There's Hannibal Lecter, who's an absolute monster. You don't get really much of the Clarice story. You're just like, oh, she's just this person dealing with this. Like, as a kid, you don't look into things, right?
Right.
So that's
Face value, man.
yeah, man. So I was like, I was blown away by it, but I was also scared shitless because of a lot of the themes in the movie. Obviously, dealing with that much gore as a young kid, you're just like, okay, I don't, you know. The only time I had seen stuff like that was in cheesy, like, B horror movies at the time. You
Right.
know, like Return of the Living Dead Part 2. I remember going get that, rent that. You know, it's got silly gags where a woman's punching a zombie's face and green goos coming out. I'm not expecting, like, people's faces to be removed and put on other people's faces. And you're just like, oh, heads in a jar and type stuff. So that really affected me, but also not in a way that I was like traumatized, like, oh, I'm going to bed and having nightmares about it. It was more like traumatizing in, oh, life actually goes that way.
Yeah.
And it was the first time I had that lesson in life, right? Like watching E.T., I was like more terrified of that until I watched Silence of the Lambs. I thought there was like some E.T. going to come and get me. And then you watch Silence of the Lambs and you realize, oh, that's the real thing.
Yeah.
The little cute alien's not real. And you start to develop that idea, right?
Right. And I love the fact that because I talk to a lot of people that border that line of, is the Silence of the Lambs a horror movie? Is it a horror movie? And sure, it's a thriller, but I think that it's absolutely a horror movie. But
Oh, yeah.
I've always said horror is what you make it. Like, I think I'm also one of the people, I would put Ghostbusters as a horror movie. Horror comedy, sure, but it's a horror movie.
I agree.
I
I
would
agree,
put
man.
the OG Terminator. I think that's a slasher film. I've always said that.
Yeah.
You got the T-800 wears a mask to cover his identity. He goes through the phone book to kill every Sarah Connor. Like, it's a total slasher to me. And Silence of the Lambs, much like Seven, is scarier, like you said, than a lot of the horror movies that we grew up with, the Nightmare on Elm Streets, especially the later parts of the franchise. And it's a movie that still stands the test of time and very, very impactful. So, which scene would you say it was, Jay, that affected you the most from Silence of the Lambs?
Well, I know that you asked me this prior to the 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 interview, but I actually watched it again last night in 4K, and it's the first time I watched it in 4K, and I honestly, that's more difficult. You know, as a young kid, I think the end of the movie is the scariest part because Clarice is now in the house. You sort of identify with her as a young kid. You're like, oh crap, this is him. You're there. Get out. Like, what are you doing there? And then you have that whole setup that the FBI is about to take him down. They're about to bust into the house. They bust into the house. No one's there. Hard cut to her at the front door opening it, and you're like, oh my God, she's all alone. Now,
Yeah.
as a kid, I looked at her as sort of a sister or mother figure as a kid, right?
You're rooting
So
for her.
you're rooting for her as a kid. You're like, oh my God, she's going to get him, but she doesn't realize she's there. So that whole sequence, when that door opens and he's like, hey, I was, as a kid, just like, basically, I remember, I think I was screaming, being like, don't go in there. Like, this is not going to go. I remember just being absolutely terrified of what was about to happen. And then it just keeps getting worse. You know, the one thing about the movie that I think people don't talk about is how real they handle some of the dialogue when it comes to, you know, in a typical horror movie, she shows up and that woman's down in the well and she's screaming like, help me now. And Clarice knows that she's alone. She's alone in that basement. She's got to deal with the threat before she can save the person in the well. And some of that dialogue that takes place between the two as she's sort of walking around is so scary, because you can feel how uneasy she is in that. She's just trying to say, you're going to be okay. But she's saying it she's such a good actress, by the way. She's saying it in a way that's she's convincing the girl in the well, but she's not convinced herself. You know, and the dialogue between it, you know, it's just terrifying as a young kid. Absolutely. Then all of a sudden the night vision.
That builds into
you like man. you watch
like that was the scene that got me as a kid, man. Like, because we all, you know, especially me and you grew up around the same time, you know, we're about the same age, and back then the thought of like night vision or virtual reality, all that was like super huge with us at that time. So
the technology,
in a horror element. Yes.
Well, dude,
like,
it was like
so scary, man.
It probably tied into how, like, you and I don't know if you were into gaming big time, but it was like that whole, when you're a kid and you get like a new piece of technology, you're like, whoa, this is interesting. What does this do? And I always remember one of the things I wanted as a kid is night vision. Everybody, you know, I'd watch sort of like, you know, not to be a downer, but the wars that were happening overseas, you'd see footage of like night vision, and as a kid you don't know what you're looking at. You don't know it's a war and people are dying. You're just like, what is that technology? And all of a sudden I'm watching the film and he's like clicks the thing down and I'm like, oh my god, this is amazing. But then also it's terrifying because he could see her, she can't see him. And you're just like, this is, I don't, you know, it actually brought forth sort of the idea of like, these things in life that you like as a kid can also be turned against you. And it was another eye opener.
Something that you wanted so bad could be, you know, be careful what you wish for type thing.
Yeah, that type of thing, you know, it's like, same as like Home Alone. If you look at that as like a movie, you're like, this is a great movie. Unbelievable. But the stuff he does to those people is like, it's a horror movie. It actually is the beginning roots of Saw. It's essentially Kevin is,
right.
You know what I mean? So it's like,
yeah, Kevin is Jigsaw.
He essentially is Jigsaw in that movie. But back on the night vision, is just terrifying. And then watching movies like Don't Breathe, bringing in the night vision at the end, sort of, you know, not the night vision in the sense somebody's wearing it, but the idea of being in a basement with no lights and trying to feel your way around. Is it'll always be Silence of the Lambs, no matter what movie you put that in.
Sure.
You know?
And it's amazing because I've never got to talk about that scene with somebody, and it's such an impactful scene. And like I said, I think it's because you and I are on the same age, so we grew up with that type of technology, wanting that in our hands. You know, the virtual reality, the night vision, 3D effects, you know, those were all fairly in their infancy, especially, you know, when we were kids. And, you know, this is a dark movie, so it's hard to kind of pick a favorite scene, but which scene would you say was your favorite from Silence of the Lambs?
I would say like the last scene in the film is such a payoff, and it's such a like little twist, and it's so brilliantly executed, because at that point in time, if you're watching it the way Jonathan Demme wants you to be watching it, you absolutely forget that Hannibal is not in jail anymore. You forget that that's even part of the movie because you're so invested in the end of the film. So you're watching a celebration, you're watching her become an actual FBI agent, you're celebrating with her as you're watching the movie, you're feeling her emotions. Yeah, dude, all of a sudden you get a phone call and you go, oh my God. And the scene is absolutely stunning. Just the way he says, you know, I'm not coming after you. You're better in the world. And then I'm having an old friend for dinner. It's just,
yes.
And then that
terrifying, man.
Yeah, that crane shot watching them walk, you know, and that doctor has flown to some country because he knows Hannibal's out there.
Right.
But Hannibal's right on him. He's always going to be on everybody. So he's instantly on top of him, and he's going to have him over for dinner, or have him for dinner.
Have him for dinner.
Which is another amazing line in the movie, right?
Right.
And I think... Yeah, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say, and I think it's like that music build up, the tension, and the way she just stands there. It's also, I don't think a lot of people realize this, because I didn't realize until I watched it last night, is when she's on the phone with him and he hangs up and she's just saying like his name over and over. When the camera starts to pull out from her, she actually looks into the lens and she puts that fear that he's in the real world out to the viewers, which is another
Right.
amazing directing choice. You know, when you break the fourth wall like that, you have to have a good reason to. So she actually looks directly into the lens and she's like, he's now in your world, deal with him, have fun. And you're just like, oh,
I've already played my part.
yeah. She's like, she's like, he's out there, you know. I'm so disappointed with the sequels of this film, because if she had come back, I don't, you know, I was going to bring this up because a lot of people are always like, well, what did you think of Hannibal and the recasting of Clarice? I mean, Julianne Moore's a goddess. I just don't,
Right.
Jodie Foster's too good in that role. You know, you can't replace that image of her in your head. I can do the same thing with video games, like that Avengers video game that came out recently. They changed all of the cast from the, you know, actual actors that people know and love, and changed them to just generic characters in the game because they didn't want to pay the actors money. Well, what happened? The game completely bombed, and that's the main reason, because you couldn't relate. You know, same as like Quentin Tarantino saying now, these actors that are in these films are known for their characters, not for their actors. And I agree with him. You know, Robert Downey Jr. is Iron Man now, and most kids growing up don't look at him and say, hey, isn't that the guy from that old tape with Mel Gibson? Nobody says that anymore. You know, that's like an 80s movie. He's just Iron Man. So you take him out of Iron Man, you put him in Dr. Dolittle, it bombs. And that's a kid's movie. So that's what happened there, right? You can't take these people out of the characters and expect the audience to be like, oh, I'll just accept it. There's cases where that's true, but it's so rare. The other thing I want to bring up to you is, and I thought was interesting, was the whole push for this to win an Oscar when it came out, and the idea of labeling it not a horror movie, but a thriller, and that was their sneaky way to get it into the Oscars. You know, I did a little bit of research trying to think, like, what are the films that got into the Oscars that were horror movies? And the only other one I really think was a major one was Misery. And that's mostly because of the acting in the movie. Kathy Bates is unbelievable in it, right? But I think the only reason that movie is that's way up. I remember watching that as a kid. That also blew me away. And that's when I learned about Stephen King and you know, Stand By Me. And as soon as you open that door,
that's a whole rabbit hole you're going down there, man.
Yeah, like I'm wearing, you know, the black phone. His son wrote this, and it's going to continue. Yeah, it's going to continue forever now. It's going to run in the family. And yeah, I've been lucky enough to actually sort of side stories. I've visited both of the It locations, from the original TV show in Vancouver where they filmed the sewer grate to the new versions in Toronto. So I've sort of been lucky enough to visit both of those. All the locations were in like Port Hope here in Canada for a lot of that stuff, like the Pennywise's house that's above the sewer that was filmed down here. So yeah, I don't know why I'm bringing that up. I love Stephen King to a certain degree. Some of his stuff is a bit like too much for me. But yeah,
but he's that guy that we definitely wouldn't be the people we are without Stephen King. You know, like he has had such an influence in horror, whether it's through literature or film, that he's really made a huge impact in the horror genre. And I don't think anybody can debate that. He really is the godfather for our generation of horror. You know, where Alfred Hitchcock was the generation before, I feel like that's who Stephen King is to us. And you know, that might be you know, Mike Flanagan for the next generation, or, you know, Jordan Peele for the next generation. I feel that is our Stephen King, you know. And
yeah. I was trying
that's actually kind of a good stepping stone right there, because we talked about The Silence of the Lambs being your first horror movie, but you know, we're talking about Stephen King and other films, and my little buddy Ghostface is here, Jay, and he has a question for you. What's your favorite scary movie, Jay? What is your favorite horror movie of all time?
It might be Scream. I mean, I watched that on VHS until the tape exploded, essentially, or melted away. you know, at that point, I can't really answer that anymore because there's so many movies. You know, I could say I
Yeah.
love Misery for 16 different reasons, or Scream, or I Know What You Did Last Summer, Urban Legend, and I grew up in the '90s slasher sort of phase of horror films. I'm an '80s kid as well, so I sort of had to backtrack in the '90s back to the '80s and say, what are the films that I've missed? Why haven't I seen them? Hellraiser, Return of the Living Dead, those type of things. You know, those when you go in the VHS store and you see the boxes when you're a kid, those stand out to you, like The Gate, or you know, I can name a million of them. Blade Runner, which is, you know, obviously not horror, but just seeing that cover in the store is just like a memory, right? So going back in time trying to remember those things and watch them these like nowadays, or just buy like special edition Blu-rays of them, that's the most fun I've had with horror lately. So it's I mean, I love Halloween. I mean, that's, you know, but that's, everybody's just going to say I love Halloween, or I love Psycho, or I love I love all of them, right? For different reasons. But I'm trying to I honestly, I think Silence of the Lambs is probably very high up there, very close to the top, just because it was the first time, you know, this sounds so cheesy, but kids are innocent. And when you see that movie, it takes the innocence away from a child. You're like,
well, especially when you see the crucifixion scene in the jail cell, you know.
yeah, I mean, that whole scene is gruesome. He's hanging up there with his gut open, guts hanging out, and then on top of it, someone's face has been ripped off. Hannibal's there, and he's got it on him. It's such a brilliant sort of escape plan. And if you really think about what's going on, it's like Buffalo Bill is essentially collecting women's skin, and you're just like, oh, that's a thing. And that the other thing I never really brought up as a kid or talked about was the sort of the male dominance of that movie over Clarice. Everybody is over top of her. Every cop is looking at, if you watch the movie again and you point out all of the sort of times that happens, it's every single male character is looking down on Clarice as either somebody not as superior, somebody not as intelligent, or just a sex object. It's like amazing, you know, it's every FBI agent's hitting on her, asking her out. And what's one of the cool things is Crawford, who's her boss, he actually does look at her in that way, and Hannibal brings it out of the mind of Clarice, and she realizes that at the end of the movie, and they even hint at it. And it's those layers I love, where he says to her during this sort of interrogation back and forth, like, oh, Jack Crawford looks at you and he thinks about having sex with you, and that's why he's brought you here. And he's like, no, that's not why, right? But at the end of the movie, you realize that Jack Crawford is a bit older, and he's really sort of in love with her. And the way he shakes her hand at the end, it's not like a creepy, let's have sex, I want you woman type deal, which is everybody else in the movie. He's actually in love with her. And you get that little sense where she knows she could go down that road, but she chooses the FBI over it. You know, she chooses her career over that idea. And that's another layer of the film that you just don't see the first time around. So that's why I would say Silence of the Lambs has so many layers. You know, as a kid also, the name of the movie, right? In the movie, it's like the screaming of the lambs becomes the silence of the lambs. And again, that's another aspect of you being a child watching this and the innocence of like slaughter. There's so many layers to that, right? People coming to slaughter in the film, you know, the idea of the butterflies and the idea of change. And it's just every aspect of this movie is so well thought out. And I love the idea. I love behind the scenes and stuff too, like commentary tracks and how things were made. So that's another reason I love this movie, is because you find out that Jodie Foster, Anthony Hopkins never met each other after that. They just had the scene. She walked down that hallway. It's obscene to think this. Walks down the hallway, shoots the scenes with him. They talk on the phone at the end of the movie. They never have a conversation outside of that. For years, they don't meet each other.
That's amazing.
Isn't that insane?
Well, and I wanted to touch on something you were just talking about, how nobody takes her serious. You even have Buffalo Bill when she's at his door.
Was she a great big fat person?
like showing that even he doesn't take her seriously. Like I'm a police officer. Oh, was she a big fat lady? You get stuff like that. Like even he is like, who the fuck are you? I don't give a shit what you have to say.
Yeah, and even when he's laughing, he's getting the
Yeah.
cards. The classic sort of thing where he throws the cards. Just before that, he's laughing because he knows in the situation where this small, petite woman is just going to absolutely be dominated once again. And it's this the theme that runs throughout the movie, and it's just a brilliant execution. I can't think of another movie that really well, I mean, yeah, of course, Alien, Sigourney Weaver, tons of 80s stuff, but I mean, in terms of like a quote-unquote real-life tale that actually happens, nothing impacted me as much as this. You know what I mean?
Right.
And, well, one of the other things I was to bring up is that I was raised by a single mother. So that also, I don't think people think about this much or even talk about this, but also the viewers of these films watch them from different perspectives. So if
Absolutely.
if I had a dad in my life, would I watch it the same way? Would I notice that all these men are being super shitty to her? But it also sort of empowered my mother in a way because I'm watching this
vicariously.
Yeah, it's like, oh, I not to sound terrible here, but as a kid in the 80s especially, think times have changed, it's a totally different viewpoint, but as a kid in the 80s when I'm like 10, 13, I'm looking at my mom not weak, but you watching movies where men are constantly
in the forefront,
and you don't really watch like these women become heroes. They're just like sometimes just set pieces or objects. Mm-hmm. So as a kid, you don't, Silence of the Lambs also the first movie where I learned that like women are essentially women are better than men, but like
essentially,
yeah,
yes, they are
in a lot of aspects. But it was the first movie where I watched it and went, "Oh, she's the hero here," and I realized like it was so well done that I just believed it. And since I believed that, I believed, oh, my mom could be that way as well. And not to get too personal, but it's not like I grew up in an amazing household and all that stuff too. So seeing this movie also made me look at my mom in a different light. So when we're in shitty situations and she's fighting back against it, I was like, oh yeah, I don't need to be as scared as I used to be because
you have a real hero there with you.
Yeah, I've watched Silence of the Lambs, so it's like she's doing the best she can, you know what I mean? So I took that from the movie, put it into my real life. And then just from a filmmaking aspect, this is also the first film that I saw that sort of made me see a movie like a painting. When you're a kid, I never understood that a motion picture was actually 24 frames per second. I didn't realize that it's like photos that are quickly coming in front of you and leaving you. And you're seeing emotion because of that. I never realized that until I looked into this movie as well. So that was a whole other aspect of filmmaking that's the spark that sort of lit that film. Also, obviously, E.T. I mean, everybody from the 80s who got into filmmaking watched E.T. and was like, oh, okay, I want to do that. But it's like also when you watch E.T. and then you watch this, if you still say you want to make horror movies after that, I think you're looking at it really from a filmmaking perspective of not just wanting to tell a magical story like a Spielberg film, but I like to have the idea of like introducing real life into it,
Sure.
Like a real life situation, like with the Lurker, the script's wrote, but going over it again, we definitely made some changes as a producer. I was like, made some suggestions in terms of like the killer. Obviously, if there's a killer in the movie, it's a horror movie. So I made some suggestions to make it more realistic based on the material that was there. You know what I mean? And also, when you do a film like this, it's so hard to not be Saw once again.
Right.
So it's like, oh, all of these things that are Saw need to come out of it. Right. So the writer director was like, yeah, we definitely need to go back over here. And again, it's about being as original as possible. Right. However, this day and age, it's hard to be original because everything has been done. I could go into any movie and say, oh, that's from that movie.
Yep.
You know, it's really a matter of the thing I learned from even the commentary track on this and just horror movies in general is that good directors take things from other directors, you know?
Well, I think what Jimmy Page said, good musicians write music, great musicians steal.
Yeah, it's the same thing. You're learning from your heroes in terms of
Yep.
filmmaking. So I'm just sitting back trying to jam as much of that stuff, and then also it's about coming up with your own vision, right? Your own actual vision. It's like somebody came up to me the other day and was just we were talking about horror movie directors and stuff, and they said, well, how do you explain people's visions, or sorry, styles? Like, how do you explain what Spielberg does on the screen in terms of like a director or even a visual artist or a DP? How is it his style? And it's so hard for me to actually answer that. Like George Romero, you watch his films, it has a very unique style to it.
Exactly.
It's like, this is a George Romero film, but I could never say to you how it is. You know, it's
Sixth Sense, man. You see it and you know it. You feel it.
Yeah, so it's, as somebody who wants to make movies, trying to come up with that is the hardest part of filmmaking, I think, because if you want to be unique and stand out and not just push out a bunch of junk, it's like Terrifier Part 1 versus Terrifier 2. Terrifier 1 is essentially the director saying, like, I love Nightmare on Elm Street. I just want to make a Halloween Nightmare on Elm Street sort of homage film. And you know, Art the Clown is iconic. But then you watch Part 2 and you go, oh shit, here's his style. Like in the first one, he's got a little style. Second movie, he's like blows it out of the water. You're like, oh, I get it now. There's a reason why people are saying this is a good film. It's because he's now has a style to how he's shooting it, right? And I again, last night I watched Piranha, Joe Dante. I think it's the second film, and like. I hate not liking things, but I'm just like, oh, you know, I just didn't enjoy it at all. I was like, I don't understand the cult classic sort of feeling on this film. But then you watch like Gremlins, which I believe was the film, 2 films after that maybe, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's his style. You know, it's
there
like
he is.
He found it. So yeah, I feel like. Trying to make the Lurker, to wrap it around here, is like it's so difficult. It's just like nowadays you could pump out a bunch of junk, and you know what's funny is like sometimes people look at things like Terrifier 1 and call it junk, but I look at it and go, this is brilliant. You know, it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. But if you were to release that movie in the 80s, it's easily one of those films that could just go into obscurity, and
nobody would have ever seen it.
That people would say, oh, do you know that scene where the girl's hanging upside down? That's all they would talk about.
The Saw.
Right? Yeah. The Saw. But nowadays, it's like, you don't see movies like that well done either.
Right. Well, because Art the Clown he's already an icon, you know, and David Howard Thornton's portrayal is just fucking amazing, man.
Which is, you know, I have to say that I was a bit naive when I first saw that stuff, right? Because you see a ton. If you're really deep into this, you see so much of this crap, and a lot of it is just people that don't understand what they're doing. Unfortunately, people give them money, and they're just like, oh, if they're aiming to make a B movie or even a C movie as a horror film, I can appreciate that. Like Suburban Sasquatch is now, you know, Red Letter Media covered that a long time ago, and all of a sudden it's got a Blu-ray release.
Right.
When in the middle of when they came out, nobody would even, you know, that's not even a film people would watch.
Sure.
But nowadays, I look at stuff like that and say, like, as a fan of horror, I don't think there's such thing as a quote unquote bad horror movie, because you can watch Suburban Sasquatch, get enjoyment out of it because of how bad it is, right?
Yeah.
You know, and obviously Red Letter Media has made that way more popular to watch bad horror movies that are actually turned out to be fun.
That's the aim. You know, a lot of people, if you go into these movies like that, or, you know, Rubber or Killer Sofa, and you're looking for Hereditary, you're going to be disappointed. You know, but if you go into these movies and you just want to have a fun time without having to think too much about a story, and you want to watch some cool kills and just have a good ride, I love watching movies like that.
That's what I love, and that's why Piranha. I was like, nope, I don't. It doesn't even have the good kills for me. I was like, why?
Right.
Are you, oh, I'm like, okay, I get it. Back in the '80s when like Jaws came out, they're just like, what's our version of it? There's like Orca, the killer whale, Roots, which they made and it's terrible, or let's go with something smaller and a bunch of them. So, obviously Roger Corman back in the days like pumps out movies like Left, Right, and Center. But it's fascinating because that movie, that was one of their biggest hits from New World. So it's interesting it's crazy to say I hadn't watched it previous. I was listening to like the Video Archives podcast, and they talked about that, and I said, oh, it's about time I order it. So boom, Scream Factory 4K, order it, thinking I'm in for some sort of ride that I haven't been on before, and it's just like constant. I don't know. Like, what is your opinion on that movie? Do you?
I'm one of those people that it's just it exists.
Yeah, I don't get it.
I wouldn't. I don't hate it, but I wouldn't go out of my way to watch it. If it was on, I would try to find something better. But again, I don't think it's not The Exorcist 2. You know what I mean? I think The Exorcist 2 is the worst movie I've ever seen in my life. And I'm with you. I don't like to slam movies. That's not who I am.
Yeah,
if you're creating art, I really, really hope there's somebody out there that enjoys it, because I would never want somebody's art to go loveless. That's one of the most cruel things I could possibly think of. But I would also be lying if I said that I enjoyed everything I've ever seen. So I do have to have this level of integrity, to be honest. And The Exorcist 2 is not for me. I think it's the worst movie I've ever seen. Piranha, I would put probably in a top 10. But again, it's one of those things where I don't think about it. Like The Exorcist 2, sometimes I'll just be like, oh, that fucking movie. Why was she tap dancing? Like there's certain things I'll just think about. Yeah. But with Piranha, it's more just like, okay, you guys did a thing. Good for you. It's just I won't watch it again. I got no desire to.
It's like once that idea gets in your head that this movie was simply made to make money, those are the horror movies that I have a difficult time watching, because I can't.
It's not about the art.
Yeah, I can't invest into it. Like it feels like everything is just on the screen, bare minimum to just get it past. Right. From every aspect. So it's like one of those movies. I'm just like, ugh.
Right.
This
is a thing that I could talk to you all day about, but before I let you go, I do want to bounce back to Silence of the Lambs real quick, my friend. And what we're going to do here real quick is rank this on a skull count. Now, Jay, we're not ranking this movie on acting, production, score, direction, nothing like that. And I think I know the answer, brother, but I still got to ask you. We're ranking this movie on how much it affected you on your first viewing. So 0 skulls being not effective, 5 being extremely effective. You can use half and quarter skulls anywhere in the middle. Jay, what would your ranking of the Silence of the Lambs be?
I think because it took my innocence. It's like I was a virgin and then all of a sudden watched it. It has to be 5 because there's no other way to look at this.
Right.
You got to remember
it's a perfect movie like that. Like it has that dash of fantasy to go along with it, but there's so much realism in this movie. The serial killer, the crazy guy behind bars, the police story, the insects, the butterfly in the mouth. Like there's so many different things in this movie that haunt you growing up. So, to start with something so realistic, like you said earlier, it's not, okay, if I don't go to sleep, this guy can't get me. If I'm not by a Camp Crystal Lake, I'm safe. This is real life, police story that is just a total horror story. So it's amazing to have such a scary movie be your starting point, like to be able to continue off of what the Silence of the Lambs, and to go from that to like watching Piranha, you're going to be like, what the fuck is this? But you got that initial high, and then you're always chasing that dragon again, looking for that scare that you got from the Silence of the Lambs. And I do want to remind everybody, I have all of Jay's social media links and YouTube link in the description. So make sure you're following him so you can stay up to date, not just on the short, not just so you can stay up to date on his YouTube channel as well, but also on the Lurker. So that way you guys can be up to date. I'm very excited about it. So I want you guys to be able to know when things are going on. And Jay, please don't go anywhere, my friend. I got a couple more questions for you. Everybody else, as always, keep talking horror, stay what you are, and we'll see you guys soon.